Okay, so you ready to go now? Let's talk about the cervical spine. So in the AMA guides related to the cervical spine, the focus of the physical exam testing is on the identification and determination of mostly neurologic conditions, specifically myelopathy and or radiculopathy. And myelopathy is defined as injury to the corticospinal tracts, and radiculopathy is defined as injury to the spinal nerve root or roots. And now some of you might be thinking, oh crap, the corticospinal tracts, I forget all about the corticospinal tracts. Well, we're going to review the corticospinal tracts and myelopathy here. So briefly, how does a person with myelopathy present to you in the physical exam? So let's imagine this. A person with myelopathy, how would they present? Well, classic complaints of myelopathy include difficulty with fine motor tasks involving the upper extremities and weakness involving the lower extremities. Let's say that again. Difficulty with fine motor tasks involving the upper extremities and weakness involving the lower extremity. Now, of course, this depends upon the site of the lesion. For lesions below the cervical spine, fine motor tasks would be preserved. However, weakness of the lower extremities would still persist. So, with a cervical spine, corticospinal tract injury, we would expect to find findings and difficulty with both the upper and lower extremities. And indeed, the AMA guides do provide for permanent impairments involving the upper extremities and involving the lower extremities, depending upon the site of the actual lesion. So what about fine motor task? Well, fine motor tasks, difficulty with fine motor tasks could include diffuse hand numbness that is not restricted to a specific dermatome. If it's not restricted to a specific dermatome, but there is this sort of ill-explained, diffuse, poorly identified hand numbness, that's more likely to be myelopathic than radiculopathic. The examinee may report clumsiness with, for example, buttoning a shirt. They might report deterioration of their handwriting. They might report difficulty with other hand-related tasks involved with normal activities of daily living. In the lower extremities, difficulty and weaknesses that may be involved in the lower extremities could present as the new onset or the recent use of a walking aid, such as a cane or a walker. This would suggest corticospinal tract involvement and would be indicative of perhaps myelopathic gait. Other findings that are rare would include urinary incontinence, urinary retention, fecal incontinence. These, of course, would suggest more extensive and more advanced myelopathic involvement. So, since hand activities and walking activities are so important in activities of daily living, we're going to clearly see some interference with normal activities of daily living in the case of cervical myelopathy. So let's review some of the activities of daily living from page 4 of the AMA guides, and let's try and imagine that we have actually in front of us a bona fide case of cervical myelopathy. How would that examinee present, and how would they respond to your activities of daily living that would suggest to you indeed that there's a bona fide injury to the corticospinal tracts? Okay, so the activities of daily living are described on page 4 of the AMA guides, and there's several categories, and you're familiar with these, but let's just consider these one by one. If you consider the activities of daily living involved with self-care and personal hygiene, that includes urinating, defecating, brushing teeth, combing hair, bathing, dressing oneself, eating, and then other activities not listed here that would be related to self-care and personal hygiene. So if a person was having difficulty and clumsiness with their hands and weakness and incoordination in the legs, how would that affect them in their self-care and personal hygiene? Would they have trouble urinating? Would they have trouble defecating? Would they have trouble with fine motor tasks involved with brushing their teeth or combing their hair or bathing and dressing oneself? Well, certainly these activities qualify as fine motor tasks. Urinating does not, but certainly cleaning up involves some hand task that you may or may not conclude is a fine motor task, but some of these others certainly are. And so you would expect that an examinee would report difficulty with these activities of daily living. Now, if your examinee shows up perfectly groomed, hair perfectly placed, clothes neat as a pin, and they did all that themselves, that would suggest to you that perhaps any difficulty with self-care and personal hygiene is minimal. Doesn't mean it's not absent, but that just gives you an indication as to the level of difficulty that they may be having. You can observe them and make your own assessment as to what type of difficulty they may be having. Well, what about communication activities? Communication activities involve writing, typing, seeing, hearing, speaking, and other. In the case of cervical myelopathy, which of those excuse me, which of those would you expect to have difficulty with? Well, certainly writing involves fine motor tasks. Typing involves fine motor tasks. How about text messaging? How about keyboarding? All of those are communication activities. How about use of the telephone? Those are communication activities that could be negatively impacted in the case of cervical myelopathy, and you would want to make that assessment in your activities of daily living interview. Okay, what about the physical activities of daily living? The AMA guys describe standing, sitting, reclining, and walking. Well, in the case of cervical myelopathy, we would expect to see weakness and incoordination of the lower extremities. Could that affect the examinee in the activity of standing? Well, yes, it could. It could make it difficult for them to stand for periods of time. It could make balance difficult while they are standing in one position for any length of time. What about walking? Yes, walking activities could be negatively impacted. Now, let's break walking down. Let's talk about walking up elevations, walking up grades, walking long distances, climbing stairs, getting out of deep chairs. All of those could be negatively affected in the case of cervical myelopathy. And these are things that you would be able to clearly identify as an objective finding during your simple observation of your examinee. You're going to notice that they're having difficulty getting out of a chair. They may present with an assistive device that is a bona fide objective finding for difficulty with walking. We'll talk a little bit more about assistive devices, but properly used and properly prescribed, an assistive device qualifies as an objective finding. Okay, so what about the sensory functions? The AMA guides describe sensory functions as part of our activities of daily living. Sensory function would include hearing, seeing, tactile feeling, tasting, smelling, and other. Well, certainly the tactile feeling could be negatively affected due to diffused hand numbness and loss of sensation due to cervical myelopathy. So that would be a normal response on your activities of daily living assessment to have the examinee report difficulties with tactile feeling. Also, non-specialized hand activities could be negatively impacted, such as grasping, such as lifting with the hands, such as tactile discrimination. All of these are consistent with cervical myelopathy. So you would expect for your examinee to report significant limitations with these non-specialized hand activities. If your examinee reports that there is no problem with grasping, no difficulty with lifting with the hands, no difficulty with tactile discrimination, that would strongly rule against the bona fide condition of cervical myelopathy. What about travel activities? That involves riding, driving, flying, and other. And depending upon the situation and the scenario, cervical myelopathy could negatively impact all of those. Same goes for sexual functions. In some cases of cervical myelopathy, sexual functions are either interfered with, hindered, or even not possible. Sometimes sexual function is reflex only without normal conscious control over sexual functions. So, for example, in males, erection and ejaculation could be negatively impacted. In females, lubrication and orgasm could be negatively affected. Similarly with sleep, depending upon the extent of involvement and the extent of, say, numbness or tingling or paresthesias in the extremities, this could interfere with restful sleep and the ability to get a normal nocturnal sleep pattern. So I mention these activities of daily living here for you as a reminder as to what you might expect a person to legitimately have difficulty with in the case of cervical myelopathy. And then conversely, in the absence of such difficulties, it gives you an indication as to the likelihood of the presence of bona fide myelopathy, or even in the presence of bona fide myelopathy, it gives you an indication as to the extent of the severity of myelopathy. And this is a concept that we talk about in one of our 3-hour programs entitled The Non-Physiologic Examination. We talk about the quantification of pain and how is it that you can quantify pain. Here we're talking about myelopathy. Well, the concept is the same because we're trying to quantify how severe is the myelopathy. And in the absence of difficulty with activities of daily living, you have to ask yourself, okay, how much, how severe, how extensive is the myelopathy? The person can walk, they can go up and down stairs, they have no problem with non-specialized hand activities, and they have normal communication activities as far as typing and writing. It gives you an idea as to the severity of the condition. So that's a good review, and that's something for you to quicken your thinking to. And also that explains the necessity of doing the activities of daily living assessment in the face-to-face meeting with the examinee.